Today, the Department of Justice is opening an investigation into whether the Baltimore Police Department has engaged in a pattern or practice of violations of the Constitution or federal law.
Baltimore is a majority city as far as its government is concerned. It has a well-integrated police department, and I think it's a mistake to use every time there's a confrontation between the police and an African-American man or woman as the occasion for investigating a police department.
Well, the current Attorney General and a former Attorney General talking about an investigation into the Baltimore Police Department. This on a day when another police department in New York came out by the thousands to say goodbye to one of their own. Law enforcement officers mourning the death of the New York Police Department's Brian Moore, the 25-year-old officer killed Saturday while on patrol in Queens. A stark difference, and the commissioner there in New York made that point.
As Brian's death comes at a time of great challenge in this country, for police officers across the country, we are increasingly bearing the brunt of loud criticism. We cannot be defined by that criticism, because what is lost in the shouting and the rhetoric is the context of what we do. A handful of recent incidents, fewer than a dozen, have wrongfully come to define the hundreds of millions of interactions cops have every year.
So what about this investigation? Let's bring in our panel. Steve Hayes, senior writer for the Weekly Standard. Juan Williams, columnist with The Hill, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Okay, Juan, the Attorney General, it's one of her first big moves, agreeing to this investigation that was called for by the mayor of Baltimore.
I think that's the most important point. I think it's a key distinction. For example, the investigation in Ferguson was one that was initiated by the federal government. Here you have the local government making the request, and of course the local government saying they will cooperate fully with the investigation. So it's of a different nature and tenor as they go into it, and the question is how does it fit into the larger pattern? And again, the effort would be, I think, with an emphasis on community policing, getting police to be in a better position to deal with what is often an untenable position they're put in, which is to go into chaotic, dysfunctional neighborhoods with high crimes, high violent crime, and be expected to somehow deal with it with out at times making mistakes.
The Baltimore Fraternal Order of Police put out a statement saying this: we suggest that as part of this comprehensive examination, the Department of Justice also consider expanding the scope of their review to include the practices and policies of the mayor of Baltimore, Stephanie Rawlings Blake. We believe that her leadership of and involvement in the police department also deserves evaluation. In their examination of the Ferguson Police Department, the DOJ included a review of the city's government from top down, and we agree that the same is required in Baltimore. Charles.
Look, you know, at some point you have to say, at what point will the federal government stop nationalizing local law enforcement? It's hard to understand why a mayor would call in the feds. After all, the police department is under the jurisdiction of the mayor, and that's how democracy works. You elect administration and they control the police department. There's sort of an admission throwing up the hand saying we don't know what's going on. You know, these laws originally intended to deal with recalcitrant, hostile, often racially hostile administrations using their power against minorities. But here in Baltimore, we have an African-American mayor, African-American police chief, African-American city's attorney, and of the 6 people charged in that wrongful death, or let's say allegedly wrongful death, 3 of them are African-American, and the one facing the most serious charges is himself African-American. So it doesn't fit the pattern. At some point, we're going to have to say localities have to regulate themselves unless there's something egregious and some reason why you cannot trust the local administration, the mayor, and that administration to deal with their own departments.
Because by doing this, Steve, it sends its own message.
Right. And I think that's actually the intent here. It's important to note that there's already an investigation. I mean, there's an investigation that was triggered by the killing of Freddie Gray of the police department broadly. This is a separate civil rights investigation, and for the reasons that Charles suggests, I think it's but perhaps redundant, maybe unnecessary. But it sends a message. I think it's a palliative. It's designed to make people feel better about the situation. It's designed to placate people who have been out in the streets protesting and raising a fuss. The problem here is that this will not, again, get to the core problems. I mean, this will not address these. We know that the president isn't going to address these. He's been handling these policies in terms of the cities in America the same way for 6 years. He made very clear in his statement after the case came out that he was not going to, that he's not going to change this. His prescription is to dump more money into cities, to expand government further, and to hope for different outcomes. We haven't had different outcomes. We've seen that the expansion of government in many cases has displaced the roles that families have had for centuries, and that's not going to change under this president. And I feel that the problem is...
Allow me a moment to speak to the two of you, because it seems to me, Charles, on your point, that in fact the protections given to police are protections, in the case of Maryland, given by the state government, not the city government. And yes, there's a mayor, and the police report to the mayor, but clearly she does not know how to reform that police department, and has failed. Previous mayors have also failed, and that's why the black community in that city feels that there is a pattern of police abusing their trust of protect and serve. And to your point, Steve, I think the president had an entire panel of police chiefs from around the nation who said, here are steps we can take to improve policing, and we're not close to it. It's not as if it's an attack on police to say, we want to improve this situation.
Well, I'm not saying it's just an attack on police, and I'm not talking only about the matter of policing here. I'm talking about the deeper cultural issues that you've talked and written about, that I think everybody agrees we need to have addressed in this country. Correct. And the president seems unwilling to address them in any kind of a serious way.
Final word.
Look, what you're saying is, in a federal system, if the locals cannot handle their situation, if they are incompetent, the feds ought to step in. I think if you have a pattern of that, you're going to end up by federalizing everything, and that's not what we want in this country.
Next up, a trip to the Candidate Casino. It is Friday.